The HFY High Council gathered in their ancient chamber, a room carved from the bones of a dead world they had conquered 8,000 years ago. And they looked upon the star maps with the bored expressions of predators who had never known true challenge. Supreme Commander Veth Aron stood before the holographic display, his scaled hand sweeping across the cluster of stars marked in soft blue, the color their systems used for species they considered beneath notice. The humans have spread to 47 systems now, he said, his voice carrying the rasping tone of his kind. They breed like insects, and they have begun to push against our border territories. The council members shifted in their seats, their tails scraping against the stone floor, and a few of them laughed, the sound coming out as a series of clicking hisses. "And this concerns us why?" asked Admiral Kethsava, the youngest member of the council at only 400 years old. "They are children playing at Empire, nothing more." Vetheran nodded slowly, his yellow eyes reflecting the glow of distant human stars. "It does not concern us," he agreed. "It irritates us, and we do not tolerate irritation." The decision took less than an hour, which was remarkably fast for a species that measured their deliberations in decades. And by the time the twin suns set over the capital world, 17 battle fleets had received their orders. They would enter human space simultaneously, strike at the border colonies, and crush any resistance before the humans even understood what was happening. And the war, if it could be called that, would be over before it truly began. The HFY did not send warnings. They did not issue demands, and they did not negotiate. Because in 12,000 years of dominion, they had never needed to explain themselves to lesser species. The corner of the council chamber, an elderly strategist named Keth Orn watched the proceedings with quiet unease, his scales having long faded from vibrant green to a dull gray that marked his advanced years. He had studied humans for decades, not because anyone had asked him to, but because something about them had caught his attention. And he had learned long ago to trust his instincts about potential threats. The others saw humans as short-lived creatures who burned bright and died young, their individual lives lasting barely a century, their civilizations rising and falling in what seemed like moments to the long-lived. HFY but Keth Orn saw something else, something in the way they rebuilt after every disaster, something in the way they refused to stay beaten. And it worried him in ways he could not quite articulate. He said nothing as the fleets launched, because no one would have listened anyway. 3 days later, the invasion began. Captain Elena Vasquez was drinking coffee in her quarters aboard the patrol vessel Persistence when the first alarm sounded, and she spilled half the cup across her console as she scrambled to the bridge. "Report," she barked as she burst through the doors, her crew already at their stations, with faces pale and eyes wide. 17 contacts translating into real space, a sensor officer said, his voice cracking. "Correction, 1,700 contacts, ma'am. They just keep coming." Vasquez stared at the tactical display and felt her stomach drop, because the ships emerging from Fold space were each larger than the largest human battleship, and they moved with the casual confidence of apex predators entering a hunting ground. "Get me command," she ordered. But she already knew it was too late for the border colonies. The HFY struck 6 worlds in the first hour, their weapons cutting through planetary shields like they were made of paper. And the emergency transmissions that reached Earth painted a picture of absolute devastation. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin received the reports in her office at United Systems Command, her tea growing cold as she read message after message of colonies going dark. And when her aide asked what they should do, she was silent for a long moment. "Activate Protocol Brennan," she finally said, her voice calm in a way that made her aide shiver. "All fleet elements are to fall back to designated rally points. No engagement with enemy forces. Repeat, no engagement." The aide stared at her in disbelief. "Admiral, we have ships in those systems. We have millions of people on those worlds. We cannot just abandon them. Chun looked up from her console, and her eyes held something that the aide would not understand until much later. Something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. We are not abandoning anyone, she said. We are doing exactly what we have prepared for. Now send the orders. Across human space. Military vessels received a command and began their withdrawal, leaving colony after colony to face the Vethkai alone. And to the invaders watching their advance, it looked like the complete collapse of human resistance. Admiral Kathsava laughed when he saw the human fleets running, his bridge crew joining in the mockery, because they had expected at least some token resistance, some futile gesture of defiance that they could crush for their amusement. They do not even fight, he said, shaking his massive head. I had hoped for some sport, but it seems we will simply walk across their territory unopposed. His fleet pushed deeper into human space, occupying world after world, and the only humans they encountered were civilians who surrendered without resistance, their faces blank and their voices quiet as they were processed into labor. Campsit was almost disappointing back in the council chamber. Cathoran reviewed the tactical data from the front lines, his old eyes scanning the patterns of human retreat, and the more he looked, the more his unease grew into something closer to alarm. The humans were not fleeing in panic. He realized they were falling back in precise formations, each ship moving to predetermined coordinates, each fleet element withdrawing along specific routes that created overlapping fields of sensor coverage. They are not running, he muttered to himself, his claws tapping against his console. They are consolidating. He tried to bring his concerns to the High Council, but they dismissed him as an old fool who had spent too long studying a primitive species, and they assured him that the war would be over within weeks. Cathoran returned to his quarters and pulled up everything he had ever collected about human history. Their wars, their defeats, their impossible recoveries from disasters that should have destroyed them. And he read late into the night when he finally set aside his datapad. His hands were trembling. The humans had a saying he had learned, something they told each other when facing impossible odds. And as he stared at the star map showing Vethkai forces spreading across human territory like a disease, the words echoed in his mind. We have not yet begun to fight. He did not sleep that night. 200 years before the Vethkai invasion, humanity had learned its first hard lesson about galactic warfare. The Krik's hegemony had been a minor power by galactic standards, barely 500 years old and controlling only a dozen systems. But to the young human civilization that had just begun reaching for the stars, they had seemed like gods. The war lasted 3 years, and humanity lost everything. Earth survived only because the Kriks grew bored and moved on to easier prey, leaving behind shattered colonies and a species that had been forced to confront an ugly truth about the universe. They were small, they were weak, and if they fought the way other species fought, they would always lose. General Maria Brennan had been a colonel when the Kriks War began and a broken woman when it ended. Her right arm replaced with a crude prosthetic, and her career seemingly finished. But she spent the next 40 years of her life writing the document that would save humanity. The Brennan Doctrine was not a military strategy in the traditional sense. It was a philosophy of survival that acknowledged humanity's fundamental weaknesses and turned them into something else entirely. Humans were short-lived compared to the elder species, rarely lasting more than a century, but that meant they could afford to think in generations, to plant seeds they would never see bloom, to sacrifice themselves for descendants they would never meet. Humans were physically weaker than most species, lacking the natural armor of the Vethkai or the redundant organs of the Kriks. But that meant every human learned from birth that survival required cunning, that the weak must be clever, or they would be food humans bred quickly by galactic standards, their populations doubling in mere decades. And while the elder species saw this as evidence of their primitive nature, Brennan saw something else. She saw an army that could absorb losses that would cripple any other civilization. She saw a species that could lose 1 million soldiers and replace them within a generation. She saw endurance weaponized. The Brennan Doctrine was taught in every military academy on every human world. But more than that, it was taught in schools, in homes, in the quiet conversations between parents and children about what it meant to be human. In a hostile universe, every citizen learned the basics of resistance, of sabotage, of how to fight an enemy without ever holding a weapon. And they learned the most important lesson of all: you do not have to win every battle to win the war. You just have to make winning cost more than your enemy is willing to pay. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin had memorized the Brennan Doctrine before she could read. Her grandmother having survived the Kriegs War, and having made certain that her descendants would never forget what humanity had learned from that defeat. Now, standing in the command center of Kepler Station, a hidden base orbiting a brown dwarf that appeared on no galactic charts, she watched her consolidated fleet arrive through the viewing window and allowed herself a small smile. The Vethkai thought they were winning. They had no idea that the war had not even started yet. "Status report," she said, turning to her operations officer. "All fleet elements have reached rally points." Commander Rodriguez replied, "We lost the Persistence and the Defiant during the withdrawal, but all other ships are accounted for, and the civilian evacuations went according to plan." Chun nodded, her expression giving away nothing of the grief she felt for the ships and crews they had lost. And the stay-behind forces? Rodriguez pulled up a display showing the occupied human worlds, each one marked with thousands of tiny green dots. All cells are in position and maintaining cover. No activations, no communications. Complete radio silence as ordered. The green dots represented millions of humans who had chosen not to evacuate. Teachers and farmers and mechanics and doctors who had looked at the approaching Vethkai fleets and decided to stay. They were not soldiers, not in any way the Vethkai would recognize, and that was exactly the point on the occupied worlds. Vethkai occupation forces were processing civilians with the efficient brutality their species had perfected over 12,000 years, sorting humans into labor categories, assigning them the work details, and feeling increasingly confident that this war was already won. They did not notice the hydroponics engineer who smiled politely while memorizing the patrol schedules of the Pafeo guards. They did not notice the maintenance worker who asked too many questions about the power grid layout. They did not notice the teacher who taught human children their lessons during the day and taught their parents how to make explosives at night. Sarah Okonkwo was one of these invisible soldiers, a 32-year-old agricultural specialist who had grown up on Kepler 442b and had refused to leave when the evacuation orders came. "Someone has to stay," she had told her sister before the last transport left. "Someone has to remember what they do to us, and someone has to make them pay for it." Now she worked in the food production facilities that fed the occupation force, her skills too valuable to waste in the labor camps. And every day she learned a little more about Vethkai biology. She learned what nutrients their bodies needed and what toxins they could not detect. She learned how their nervous systems responded to certain compounds, and how their cognitive functions could be degraded over time with the right chemical combinations. She learned it, and she waited, because the Brennan Doctrine had taught her that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Black at Kepler Station, Admiral Chun addressed her captains in a briefing room that felt too small for the weight of what they were about to discuss. "The Vethkai have taken 31 of our worlds," she said, her voice flat and calm. "They have killed or captured millions of our people, and they believe this war is nearly over." She pressed a control, and the display behind her shifted to show the Vethkai supply lines, a vast web of shipping routes and communication relays stretching across the occupied territories. "They are wrong," She began outlining the next phase of operations. The hit-and-run attacks on supply convoys, the infiltration of enemy sensor networks, the slow, careful work of mapping every weakness in the HFY war machine. "We will not fight them directly," she said. "We cannot afford to, not yet, but we will bleed them. Every day, in ways they will not understand until it is too late." Her captains listened with the focused attention of predators, learning the habits of their prey. And when she finished, the oldest among them, a scarred veteran named Captain Eulerin, raised his hand. "Admiral, how long do you expect this phase to last?" Chun considered the question for a moment before answering. "Months, years, perhaps decades. However long it takes for them to realize they cannot hold what they have taken." Eulerin nodded slowly, his expression grim but determined, and then Chun smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "Then we take it back in the HFY capital." Catharin continued his lonely study of human history, growing more alarmed with each passing day as he watched the occupation reports and saw patterns that no one else seemed to notice: equipment failures that happened just often enough to be annoying, but not often enough to be suspicious; supply shipments that arrived damaged in ways that were always attributed to handling errors; soldiers who developed minor illnesses that never quite became epidemics. He tried again to warn the High Council, and again they dismissed him. "You worry too much, old one," Supreme Commander Vethorin told him. "The humans are beaten. They simply do not know it yet." Catharin returned to his quarters and added another entry to his private journal. The words, "He could not speak aloud to anyone who would listen, I fear." He wrote that we are the ones who do not know, and by the time we realize the truth, it will be far too late. 6 months after the invasion began, Admiral Kethsava stood in his command center and stared at reports that made no sense. The war should have been over by now. The humans should have been completely pacified. Their remaining fleets should have been hunted down and destroyed. And yet somehow none of these things had happened. Instead, his occupation forces were drowning in problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. Another supply convoy lost, his logistics officer reported, her voice tight with frustration. The Vigilant and her escort vessels were ambushed in the Kepler 186 transit corridor. No survivors. No trace of the attacking force. Kethsava's claws dug into the armrest of his command chair, hard enough to leave gouges in the metal. "That is the 4th convoy this month," he growled. "Where are these human ships coming from? Our sensors show nothing in that sector." No one had an answer, because the human fleet under Admiral Chun had become a ghost, appearing without warning to strike vulnerable targets and vanishing. Before reinforcements could arrive, the attacks were never decisive, never threatening to turn the tide of the war, but they were constant. And each one cost the HFY ships they could not easily replace. Meanwhile, on the occupied worlds, things were somehow even worse. The factories that the HFY had seized to support their war effort kept experiencing mysterious malfunctions, producing equipment with microscopic flaws that caused failures weeks or months after, manufacture weapons that misfired at critical moments, vehicles whose engines seized without warning, communication devices that developed intermittent static that made coordination nearly impossible. The HFY engineers who investigated could never find evidence of sabotage, because the humans who had designed these failures were experts at making them look like accidents. Sarah Okonkwo watched the HFY patrol march past her workstation and smiled to herself as she continued her work in the food production facility. It had been 6 months since she had begun her quiet war, and the results were finally starting to show. The compound she had been introducing into the HFY food supply was undetectable by their standard testing procedures. A blend of trace elements that were harmless in small doses but accumulated in HFY neural tissue over time. The first symptoms would be subtle: mild confusion, difficulty concentrating, a tendency to make small mistakes, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage would be irreversible. She was not the only one across the occupied territories. Thousands of humans were waging their own invisible wars, each one choosing their own targets and methods, each one contributing to a collective effort that no single person controlled. A maintenance worker on Kepler 62F had spent 3 months mapping the power grid before introducing cascading failures that left the occupation headquarters without electricity for 16 hours. A teacher on Glee 667C had organized her students into a communication network that passed messages between resistance cells using coded phrases hidden in children's songs. A doctor on Tau Ceti E had been treating Vethkai soldiers with medications that slightly worsened their conditions instead of curing them. Never enough to be obvious, always enough to keep them weak. None of these actions would win the war on their own, but together they created a constant drain on Vethkai resources. Morale and patience. Admiral Chung kept her fleet moving, never staying in one place long enough to be found. And she struck wherever the enemy showed weakness. A fuel depot here, a communication relay there, a troop transport that had wandered too far from its escorts. She lost ships in these engagements, sometimes many ships, but she always inflicted more damage than she took. And she knew that mathematics was on her side. The Vethkai had crossed hundreds of light years to fight this war, their supply lines stretching back to their home territory, while the humans were fighting in their own space. Surrounded by resources and allies who hated the invaders, time was not on the Vethkai side. Even if they did not realize it yet, 3 months later, a Vethkai hunter-killer group finally caught one of Chun's destroyers, a small vessel called the Remembrance that had been laying sensor mines in a transit corridor. Ship fought until her weapons were empty and her hull was breached in a dozen places. And when the Vethkai boarding parties finally reached the bridge, they found only corpses and a captain who was still somehow alive, despite wounds that should have killed her. Captain Yuki Tanaka smiled at her captors through blood-covered teeth as they dragged her to their interrogation chamber. And when they demanded to know the location of the human fleet, she laughed. "You still do not understand," she said, her voice weak but steady. "We are not trying to beat you." The interrogator, a scarred veteran who had broken prisoners from a dozen species, leaned closer with interest. "Then what are you trying to do?" Tanaka's smile widened. "We are trying to exhaust you." She died before they could extract any useful information, her heart stopping from the accumulated damage of battle and interrogation. But her words traveled back to the Vethkai High Council and planted a seed of doubt in minds that had never known uncertainty. Catherine read the interrogation report 3 times before setting it aside, his old hands trembling slightly as he reached for his datapad. He'd been tracking the casualty figures, the supply losses, the equipment failures, and now he laid them all out in a single document that painted a picture the High Council had refused to see in 6 months of occupation. The Vethkai had lost more ships to ambushes and accidents than they had lost in the conquest itself. Their occupation forces were spread across 31 worlds, each one requiring constant reinforcement as soldiers felt illness, equipment failures, and the occasional open attack. Their supply lines were bleeding resources at a rate that would become unsustainable within 2 years. Perhaps sooner if the human attacks continued to increase. He brought his findings to Supreme Commander Vethorin, laying out the data with the precision of a scholar who had spent his life learning to see patterns that others missed. "We are winning every battle," he said, "but we are losing the war. The humans are not trying to defeat us in combat. They are trying to make this occupation too expensive to maintain." Vethorin stared at the numbers for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What do you recommend?" Catherine hesitated, because what he was about to suggest went against every instinct of his species. "We should withdraw. negotiate a settlement, and leave human space before our losses become catastrophic. The silence that followed was deafening when Veth Orin finally spoke. His voice was cold with contempt. We are the Vethkai Dominion. We do not retreat from primitives who hide in shadows and poison our food. We crush them. He stood and loomed over the old strategist. His superior height meant to intimidate. You will speak no more of withdrawal. Instead, you will find me solutions. Find their fleet. Find their leaders. Find whatever hole they are hiding in, and we will burn it to ash. Ketharam bowed his head in submission, because he had no choice. But as he left the chamber, he knew with terrible certainty that his warnings had come too late. The Dominion had stepped into a trap, and they were too proud to see the jaws closing around them on Kepler 442b. Sarah Okonkwo received a coded message through the Resistance Network. 3 words that made her heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Phase 2 begins. She looked out her window at the Vethkai soldiers patrolling the streets. Still confident, still certain of their superiority, still completely unaware of what was coming. You should have listened to your old strategist, she whispered. Now it is too late for all of you. The Vethkai High Council gathered for an emergency session. Their ancient confidence finally cracking under the weight of mounting losses and growing. Frustration Supreme Commander Veth Orin paced before the assembled leaders, his tail lashing with barely contained rage as he delivered his assessment of the war. The humans refused to fight like civilized beings. He snarled. They hide. They sabotage. They poison. They strike from shadows and vanish before we can respond. This is not warfare. This is pest control. Admiral Kathsava stepped forward with a proposal that made even the hardened warriors of the council pause. We must make examples, he said, his voice cold and certain. Select 5 occupied worlds and bombard them from orbit. Destroy their cities, kill millions of their civilians. Show them what happens to species that defy the Dominion. The council debated for hours, some arguing that such brutality would only harden human resistance, others insisting that nothing else would break their spirit in the end. Fear won over wisdom. The order went out across Vethkai communication networks, broadcast openly so that every human could hear it. 5 worlds had been selected for pacification, and in 7 days their major population centers would be reduced to glass and ash. The message was clear. Surrender completely or watch your people die on Kepler Station. Admiral Chun watched the broadcast with an expression that revealed nothing of the cold fury burning in her chest. Her staff stood around her in silence, waiting for orders, waiting for some response to the threat that hung over 5 million human lives. They think this will break us, Chun said quietly. They think we will surrender to save our people. She turned to face her officers, and something in her eyes made them stand a little straighter. They are wrong. She activated the station's communication array and began transmitting on every frequency, every channel, every network that humans could access. And a few that the Vethkai thought were secure. Her face appeared on screens across human space, on hidden resistance terminals in occupied territories, and in the command centers of Vethkai. Ships that had been compromised months ago without their crews ever knowing. My name is Admiral Chen Wei Lin, she said. I speak to every human who can hear me, and I speak to the Vethkai who believe they have won this war. She paused, letting the silence stretch. You want to bomb our civilians? Go ahead. Kill millions of us. We will remember every single name, and we will take 100 of yours for each one of ours. Her voice hardened. Not today. Not tomorrow, but we will never stop coming. We will never stop fighting, and we will never forgive. She leaned closer to the camera. You should have destroyed us when you had the chance. Now it is too late. The transmission ended on the Vethkai flagship. Admiral Kathsava watched the human admiral's defiance and laughed. Brave words from a woman whose fleet is pinned down 3 sectors away, he said to his bridge crew. She cannot reach us in time to stop the bombardment. And she knows it. He was right that Chun's main fleet was 3 sectors away, positioned exactly where Vethkai intelligence believed it to be. He was wrong about everything else. For 6 months, while her visible forces had been conducting hit-and-run attacks and drawing Vethkai attention, Chun had been doing something else. Entirely small ships, running silent, had been slipping through gaps in Vethkai sensor coverage, planting stealth beacons in systems the enemy believed were secure. Agents had been bribing neutral species for transit codes, mapping patrol routes, identifying the blind spots in the Dominion's defensive network. The retreating fleet had not been running away. It had been infiltrating, learning, preparing for this exact moment. 3 days before the scheduled bombardment, Chun's fleet vanished from Vethkai sensors. The Dominion's admirals assumed they had simply gone deeper into hiding, perhaps fleeing to some remote system to wait out the coming destruction of their worlds. They were wrong. The primary Vethkai shipyard was located in a heavily defended system deep within Dominion territory, surrounded by minefields and sensor platforms, and a home defense fleet that had never lost a battle. It was the heart of Vethkai military production, the place where their massive warships were built and repaired, and it was considered absolutely invulnerable to attack. Admiral Chun's fleet appeared directly above it without warning. The Vethkai defenders had exactly 17 seconds to realize what was happening before the first missile struck. All batteries fire, Chun ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around her. Priority targets are the construction base. Secondary targets are the fuel storage facilities. We have 4 minutes before their fleet can respond. The human ships unleashed everything they had. A storm of weapons fire that turned the shipyard into an expanding cloud of debris and flamed 17 capital ships under construction. Vessels that would have taken years to replace were destroyed in minutes. The fuel reserves that would have powered the occupation for another year ignited in explosions, visible from the planet's surface. When the Vethkai home defense fleet finally scrambled to respond, they found that their communications were compromised. Every order was intercepted and decoded before it could be executed. Every formation was anticipated and countered. Every trap they tried to spring was somehow already known to the enemy. The human fleet fought with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, each ship knowing exactly where to be and when to be there. And when the battle was over, they vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a crippled shipyard and a Vethkai fleet that had suffered its worst defeat in 1,000 years on the occupied worlds. Resistance cells received the signal they had been waiting for since the invasion began. Sarah Okonkwo was eating dinner in her small apartment when her hidden communication device buzzed with a single word. Now, she set down her fork, took a deep breath, and walked to the door across Kepler 442b, across all 31 occupied worlds. Millions of humans stopped what they were doing and began to move, not to fight, not yet, but to complete the preparations they had been making for 6 months. Power stations experienced catastrophic failures as workers who had been planning this moment for months triggered hidden faults in the equipment they maintained. Communication networks went dark as technicians activated kill switches they had installed during routine maintenance. Atmospheric processors developed malfunctions that forced Vethkai soldiers to retreat to their ships or suffocate in one coordinated hour. Every piece of critical infrastructure on every occupied world failed simultaneously. The Vethkai occupation forces suddenly found themselves blind, deaf, and unable to breathe, scattered across 31 worlds that had just become death traps. Sarah led herself through the darkness of a city without power, moving toward the planetary governor's compound with the confidence of someone who had memorized every patrol route and guard position. The Vethkai soldiers they encountered were already weakened, months of subtle poisoning having finally done its work, and they offered little resistance when Sarah reached the governor's office. She found the senior Vethkai official sitting alone in the dark, his scales pale with fear. "You should leave," she said simply. "While you still can." The governor stared at her with eyes that had finally begun to understand. "How?" he whispered. "How did you do this?" Sarah smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "We have been doing this since the day you arrived. You just did not notice until now. In the Vethkai capital, Kethoran received reports from the occupied territories and watched his worst fears become real at Ether One worlds in chaos. Supply lines severed, communication networks destroyed, and a home fleet that had just been humiliated in their own territory. He began drafting a message to the High Council, the message he had been trying to deliver for months. "We have lost," he wrote, "not because we are weak, but because we underestimated an enemy who does not fight the way we expected. We can still win this war if we commit everything we have, but the cost will be greater than anything we have ever paid." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Or we can leave. Accept our losses and pretend this never happened. The choice is yours, but it must be made now. Because every day we delay, the humans grow stronger and we grow weaker." He sent the message and waited for a response. He already knew would come too late. The Dominion had finally realized the truth. But by then, the humans had already struck again. The withdrawal of the Vethkai Dominion was not a surrender, at least not officially. Supreme Commander Vethoran stood before the High Council one final time and announced that military operations in human space would be concluded due to changing strategic priorities, and that Dominion forces would be redeployed to address more pressing concerns elsewhere. No one in the galaxy believed him. Retreat began slowly, carefully, with Vethkai forces pulling back from the most remote worlds first, trying to maintain the illusion of an orderly withdrawal rather than a desperate flight. But the humans were not interested in letting them leave peacefully. Admiral Chun's fleet shadowed the retreating Dominion forces, never engaging directly, but always visible on sensors, a constant reminder of what would happen if the withdrawal slowed or stopped on the occupied worlds. Resistance cells emerged from hiding and began making the Vethkai departure as painful as possible. Supply convoys were ambushed and transit rearguard units found their positions suddenly surrounded by civilians who were no longer pretending to be harmless. Equipment left behind was sabotaged so thoroughly that none of it could be salvaged. Sarah Okonkwo stood on a rooftop and watched the last Vethkai transport lift off from Kepler 442b, its engines glowing against the night sky as it climbed toward orbit around her. The city was celebrating, people pouring into streets that had been patrolled by alien soldiers just days before, their voices raised in songs of triumph and relief. But Sarah did not celebrate. She thought about the friends she had lost, the years she had spent living in fear, the things she had done to survive and to fight back, and she felt only a cold satisfaction that it was finally over. Beside her, her sister Maria had arrived from the refugee camps where she had spent the occupation, and she put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" Maria asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about what comes next," she said. "I am thinking about making sure this never happens again in the Vethkai capital." Kethoran was summoned to meet with the new Supreme Commander, a younger officer named Vethsara, who had risen to power after the previous leadership had been quietly removed from their positions. "You warned us," Vethsara said, her voice carrying none of the contempt that her predecessor had shown. "You saw what was coming, and we did not listen." Kethoran bowed his head. "I took no pleasure in being right," he replied. "I only wish to spare our people from unnecessary suffering." Vethsara studied him for a long moment. "Tell me truly, Strategist. Could we have won that war if we had committed everything we had? Kethoran considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps, he said. If we had been willing to spend 50 years and a third of our fleet exterminating every human in existence, we might have succeeded, but even then I am not certain. Why? The old strategist looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. Because humans do not stop. They do not surrender. They do not accept defeat. You can kill millions of them, and the survivors will simply have millions of reasons to hate you. You can destroy their worlds, and they will rebuild. You can break their fleets, and they will build new ones. He shook his head slowly. They are not like us. They do not measure victory in territory or resources. They measure it in survival, and they will sacrifice anything. Endure anything, wait any length of time, to ensure that survival. Bessar was silent for a long moment. Then we were fortunate to escape when we did. Yes, Keth Arn agreed. We were. 10 years past, humanity rebuilt its devastated worlds, buried its dead, and remembered what had been done to them. They did not seek revenge against the Vethkai Dominion, because revenge would have meant another war, and they had lost enough of their people already. But they did not forget. The Brennan Doctrine was updated and expanded. New strategies were developed, new defenses were constructed, and every human child learned the history of the invasion and the lessons. It had taught Admiral Chun, retired after the war, and spent her remaining years teaching at the military academy, passing on her knowledge to the next generation of officers who would protect humanity from future threats. Sarah Okonkwo became a leader in the reconstruction efforts on Kepler 442b, helping to rebuild the infrastructure that had been destroyed during the resistance. And she never spoke publicly about her role in the occupation. The galaxy took notice of what had happened. Species that had dismissed humans as short-lived primitives began to look at them differently, seeing not weakness but something far more dangerous. The Thrall Consortium, an elder species that had been eyeing human territory for centuries, sent envoys to discuss mutual understanding rather than the demands they had originally planned to make. The Krix hegemony, the species that had nearly destroyed humanity 2 centuries before, quietly closed its borders to human traffic and made no aggressive moves toward human space. And the great councils where galactic powers gathered to discuss matters of importance, human diplomats were treated with a respect that had nothing to do with their military strength and everything to do with what they had proven about themselves. Ambassador Adaura Okonkwo, Sarah's daughter, attended one such council 30 years after the invasion had ended. A Thrall representative approached her during a reception, his massive form looming over her smaller frame as he made what he clearly thought was subtle reference to the exciting opportunities for cooperation between their species. Ambassador Okonkwo smiled politely and sipped her drink. I appreciate your interest in cooperation, she said, and I should mention that our analysts have been studying your civilization for several years now. The Thrall's expression flickered with surprise. We have identified your major supply routes, she continued, cataloged your military leadership, and mapped 17 critical vulnerabilities in your infrastructure, just in case you were considering anything rash. The Thrall stared at her in silence. The thing about humans, Ambassador Okonkwo said, her voice pleasant and warm despite the cold steel beneath her words, is that we are always preparing for the next war. We learned that lesson a long time ago. She finished her drink and set the glass aside. By the time you realize we have struck, we have usually already struck again. She walked away, leaving the Thrall representative standing alone with his thoughts. And as she crossed the reception hall, she passed a young Vethkai diplomat who had been watching the exchange. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. The Vethkai diplomat nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement from one survivor to another, and Ambassador Okonkwo returned the nod before continuing on her way. The war between their species was over. But the lessons it had taught would endure for generations. Humans were no longer considered vermin by the elder species of the galaxy. They were considered something else entirely, something that made ancient empires think twice before crossing them, something that waited in the darkness with patience and memory and an absolute refusal to ever be conquered. And somewhere in the vast archives of human military history, the Brennan Doctrine sat waiting for the next enemy who would make the mistake of underestimating humanity, because there would always be another enemy, and humanity would always be ready. The last line of the document, added by Admiral Chun herself before her death, summed up everything that humans had learned about survival in a hostile universe. "We do not start wars," it read, "but we finish them. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs, we finish them." And they always would.